everyone, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon to discuss the need to build an inclusive news sector and also to address issues beyond the notion of inclusivity. So thinking a bit about the differences between reformist approaches and approaches that involve working towards creating something entirely new and different to what the current landscape has to offer. As well as there being a moral responsibility and legal obligation to ensure that news and newsrooms are inclusive, Cluster recognises the great benefits of representing different communities on and off screen. So Cluster offers funding for innovation within the screen and news sector within Wales, connecting with academia and industry. I'm pleased to be joined by 3 Cluster project leaders this afternoon to talk about their work and why it's so essential. Before I speak about our wonderful panelists and all that they've been doing, I'm going to briefly introduce myself. So my name is Dr. Francesca Zabandi, and I'm a lecturer in digital media studies and director of the BA in Media Journalism and Culture at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University. A lot of my own work focuses on different questions and issues to do with identity, inequality, and ideology, with an emphasis on the media. So I've done quite a few projects that centre the experiences of Black women in Britain, and I recently finished writing a book on the digital lives of Black women in Britain, which was published with Palgrave Macmillan this summer. I'm not part of Cluster myself, but I'm aware of the great work that is going on and the great work that all of our panellists have been doing. So I was really delighted to get the opportunity to be in conversation with them today. I believe that Cluster wanted to do this session really to raise awareness of the different reasons why it's important that the news sector is evolving and changing to be more inclusive and to be more diverse, and to also offer this session as an introduction to some of the key debates and considerations in creating a more inclusive news sector. This is also a chance to really showcase some of the leading research, thinking, and action that is being done by our brilliant panelists. So joining us today is Shirish Kulkarni, award-winning journalist and researcher with 25 years experience working in all the UK's major broadcast newsrooms. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about all the brilliant work that Shirish has been doing. We're also going to hear from Grace Quantock, who is a psychotherapeutic counsellor, writer and researcher specialising in working with people with multiple marginalised identities and trauma. And again, I'm familiar with some of Grace's fantastic work, so I'm really excited to learn more about all that Grace has been doing in this space. We're also going to be speaking to Linus Harrison, who is a social entrepreneur and a support worker specialising in supporting neurodiverse people to live the lives they love. And I know that Linus has been doing some really fantastic research and has been doing some brilliant work that really focuses on questions to do with visual culture and the different ways that news can be communicated and conveyed so that we're not always focusing on text and written-based content. So we'll be asking our panelists to give us a brief introduction to their areas of research, and then we'll have the opportunity for any of your questions. So please do post these in the Q&A function throughout. So I'm going to start by speaking to Shirish, and I just wanted to say thank you again for joining us today. And something I was thinking about when reading about your work was, based on your extensive experience, it would be great to learn more about your thoughts on efforts to create an inclusive news sector, this notion of inclusivity, what it does mean, what it doesn't, and also some of your thoughts on working beyond the notion of inclusivity. So considering the different ways that we can or can't address structural inequalities and oppression in the news sector and beyond.
Yeah, so thanks, Francesca, and thanks to Beyond for having me today as well. So I normally say when I do these things, it's a real privilege to be talking here. But frankly, this is kind of the opposite of that, isn't it? Because I'm here because I don't have the privilege of being white, amongst other things. And ultimately, me, Grace, and Linus are here to talk about why the journalism industry, for some reason, isn't yet quite persuaded by the argument that all human beings are fundamentally equal. And that is why we're here. And it's my industry's unwillingness and inability to engage with that basic truth that has frankly got us into this mess. I don't mean some kind of internal industry mess. I mean the big old mess in society, because I don't care about journalism for journalism's sake. I only care about it because of the way it shapes society and drives discourse. So I'm often asked at conferences and things like this, how we can support and protect the industry. And that's often how these conversations are framed. But again, I'm going to be honest and say, I'm not here to protect the industry. In so many ways, it's a crappy industry with lots of crappy people and lots of crappy attitudes. And arguably, we need to tear it all down and start again. So my research, which is really into innovative forms of news storytelling, because we're failing on so many of those measures, has yielded what I call the 7 building blocks of reflective journalism. And I see those as a way of looking at what's important differently and in reversing the audience retreat from news by getting us as journalists to reconnect, frankly, with the reasons most of us became journalists, to make a difference and to tell stories about things that mattered. But fundamental to those building blocks is a really thoroughgoing approach to inclusion. And right now, journalism has a really big problem with inclusion, which covers gender, disability, class, sexuality, neurodiversity, the whole gamut. So if I can use just race as an example here, let me put this very clearly. There is racism in our newsrooms, and those racist viewpoints and the supremacy of the white gaze infect everything about our discourse in society. And put really simply, if people of colour were driving editorial decisions in newsrooms, then all our discussions about immigration, inequality, education, crime, everything would be entirely different. And we need to recognise that really honestly and address it with the very greatest urgency, I think. However, having said that, I have to say I'm not very hopeful. I mean, the title of this session is Towards an Inclusive News Sector, but I'm genuinely not sure we're any closer to that than when I started out 25 years ago. The very first job I had in journalism was researching a BBC Radio 4 documentary on racism. And you could put out that same documentary today and it would work. It wouldn't feel dated in the slightest because all the same problems exist and nothing has really changed. But I don't really want to have those conversations anymore. I'm really tired of it at a kind of fundamental, visceral level. And to share a bit of my story, I essentially left journalism 6 years ago because I couldn't pay the emotional price anymore. I'd fought for so long to bring different perspectives, to tell different stories, reflect the world better and more inclusively. But all that time, I was being gaslighted by the organisation, the industry. I'd endured so many eye rolls, so many dismissals of my thoughts and feelings, so little acknowledgement of my achievements while other people were being championed and promoted, that I'd started to believe I couldn't do journalism, but I was just no good at it. And that's not just my story. That's the story of pretty much anyone who actually brings the diversity of views the newsroom leaders say they want, but very few actually want to hear. So the key problem with our industry right now is that we use notions of objectivity as our defense against almost every criticism, but that's entirely nonsense. So our so-called news values aren't some collection of objective truths. They're a system of entirely subjective beliefs, which are shaped by the dominant groups in our newsrooms. Let's just call them white, metropolitan, middle-aged men for the sake of argument. And those beliefs are grounded in a fundamentally conservative, with a small c, view of the world, because it's all about maintaining the power they hold. And if we accept there's racism, sexism, ableism in newsrooms, which I think we do, then we have to accept that many of those people with power don't deserve it. It's really not theirs. Other people should have had it all along. And if those gatekeepers are not prepared to give up or at least share some of that power, then any other talk about diversity and inclusion is just completely empty. If you want to really start moving towards a more inclusive news sector, we need to start by treating diversity as more than just a problem of PR. What I'm concerned about right now, particularly right now, is the reaction of many newsrooms to Black Lives Matter and everything which has surrounded that, is to respond in an entirely superficial, comms-driven way. We better do some stuff that foregrounds people of colour or we'll look bad. And that is not it. We have to get hold of the fact that this is a matter of fundamental equality. And that also means we can't create some bizarre hierarchy of diversity. So what we get right now is people of colour getting a bit of love for a few months because we're a PR priority. Whilst in the meantime, people with disabilities or from a different class or geographical background or gender or sexuality get pushed even further back in the queue. That is not what real diversity or real inclusion look like. That is what failure looks like. And we can't afford to fail anymore. Because to come back to my initial point, if we fail, society fails.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I've got lots of questions I'd love to ask, but I'm just going to stick to one for now, so that we've got enough time for audience questions later on. So I was thinking, two particular points jumped out for me. One was thinking about the limitations of the notion of, or the language of, inclusivity, and how sort of corporatized understandings of equality, diversity and inclusion that prioritize reputational risk and PR opportunities are sometimes viewed as though they're radical, when in fact they're not. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on moving away from speaking and thinking about inclusivity and just reflecting on the work that all of you do, really. And what words or what goals or what terms do you find might be more helpful? So it might be, for me, I think about collectively trying to work towards or struggle towards freedom. So any of your thoughts on that? And I was also thinking about how, from what you shared with us, oftentimes we see inequality and inequalities treated as though they are separate issues. Yeah. So people won't acknowledge the fact that there are disabled Black people from working class backgrounds who are affected by the intersecting nature of oppression. So any thoughts on both elements of what you spoke about there?
Yeah, so on the first one, the corporatization is a kind of classic one. And it's the context in which diversity and inclusion, those are horrible words now. They weren't, but they are now, are treated as a PR problem. And a particular problem I've seen is how the answer is seen, say, well, the bottom line will benefit if you do inclusion better. And it just blows my mind that that is where we've got to. But as I say, we're not convinced by the argument that people are just fundamentally equal. We have to be convinced by some kind of like notion of money being more important, and that's the only way we can reach these people. Frankly, if that's the only way I can reach your manager, I don't want to work with your manager or for your manager. That's not an organization or an industry I want to work in if it's about the bottom line that we get equality. On the notion of the language, I think, look, I'm not really kind of restrictive about language. I think diversity and inclusion are used in that corporatized way. And I guess I like to think more about representation and being at the table, because at the moment, we're always at the edges of the table. As I say, I used to get those eye rolls in meetings for 25 years if I brought up a story about or from Wales, let alone before we bring in anything else. Just talking about Wales in a journalism organisation in the UK is seen as a bit of a joke. And yet people expect the viewers and readers in Wales to trust those organisations. And as I always say, that is not how relationships work at all. You can't just ignore people, say out loud you're not interested, and expect people to engage with you. And I think on the second point, I think, as I say, and there are different concerns we all bring, but actually, ultimately, it's all about basic equality and basic humanity, and newsroom leaders having some basic humanity, looking at their kind of notions of objectivity and reframing those in terms of the world we live in, not the world we lived in 50 years ago, because they were wrong then, and they're particularly wrong now, and being prepared to admit that they don't understand the world anymore, because that's where it comes from. These people, the gatekeepers, do not understand the world anymore. And the only way they can maintain their power is by pushing all that stuff away and pretending it doesn't exist. So I think there does need to be a really fundamental reevaluation, which is why I was particularly taking my point about, can we reform, or do we have to have a revolution?
Thank you very much for that. And again, so many things I'm thinking about. I really appreciate the fact you've also brought up the impact of sort of internal power dynamics between the nations within the UK, and how that feeds into different questions to do with inequality and oppression, and what is or isn't viewed as being so-called niche or parochial. As someone who was born in Scotland and spent most of my life there, but it's also my mum's side of the family as well, which is something I'm very familiar with. So I appreciate you bringing that up too. I'd just like to turn to speak to Grace now for a while, and also wanted to say thank you for taking part in this discussion too, and really thinking about the expansive work that you do. I'm very interested in your thoughts on issues related to how news can traumatize and re-traumatize people, and whose responsibility it might be to try and ensure that the news sector works in ways that are intended to mitigate the potential harm and trauma that might be caused by news content and how it's shared.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you, Sharish, and thank you everybody for joining us here today. I do think that actually what I'm speaking about in many ways reflects the impact of what Sharish was talking about. Those years of eye rolls, those microaggressions between individuals, the macroaggressions from the institutions, the organizations, that build up for many people into a level of cultural, relational, of psycho-emotional trauma that can actually lead to an internalization. This, exactly as she said, this gaslighting that actually leads to people becoming impacted, doubting themselves, dropping out. We lose valuable people that, quite frankly, this planet needs. And you know, it puts me in mind, today is actually the International Day of Disabled People, and it puts me in mind of the words of Alice Wong, who's a fantastic disability activist and writer out of the US, who says, "Make it accessible or burn it down," and which are words I'm taking into sharing a little bit about my research today. So I am a therapist and a researcher, and my cluster R&D research is about titrating news delivery and reception to reduce re-traumatization and increase engagement for people with high trauma loads. So that is going to often be marginalized folks, but it's going to be a whole lot of people. But it can benefit journalists too, who can also get traumatized from the material that they're actually working with. And really anybody who's thinking about taking in challenging information online. So while this starts with news, this could also impact how we take in health information online in the future. How are COVID test results delivered? How do we receive this information virtually? So trauma may be invisible in us, but its impacts are not. And trauma is impacting on news delivery, and we need to attend to it if we care about our audiences. It's about our impact, not just about our intentions. And if we really mean what we say about audiences, then we need to look at this, because as Sharish says, our current news system is broken. And what I notice about it as a psychotherapeutic counsellor and writer and a trauma survivor myself is that while the news may be curated by editors, by journalists, it's consumed unconsciously in the manner of its delivery. So I don't get to easily curate my news consumption. I just swallow the feed. The feed is the feed. The landing page is the landing page. The news program is the news program. And yet the aspect of trauma I want to explore very briefly with you today from my research is how trauma can steal our teeth. So trauma disempowers, and it can create dissociation and numbness, and we aren't present. We can also be incredibly hypervigilant. So we're really attuned to the outside environment. We're taking a lot of information. We're searching for it in order to stay safe, but we don't notice perhaps what we're swallowing, and so we can't feel its impact. And it's a little bit like Sleeping Beauty. The castle sleeps, and nobody is guarding the gates. And trauma, often being invisible or stigmatized or gaslit or hidden, can mean that nobody sees us as a survivor of trauma, and so nobody is guarding us either, so there's no shielding. There's no discrimination in terms of choosing and understanding. There's no biting off a piece, chewing it over, spitting out the bits that we decide, actually, gosh, that journalist biases are really showing through there. I'm going to disregard those pieces. There's no digesting, integrating. We just swallow things whole. And maybe we don't feel safe enough, or contained, or present, or powerful enough. Perhaps we've been taught by systems and structures and people that we aren't powerful. And so we're not in a place to be able to discriminate or discern. But you'll notice perhaps that in fairy tales, when the person is at risk or after risk, they're often taught to discern. So to pick the poppy seeds from the dirt in the house of the Baba Yaga, or to actually see the wolf in grandmother's clothes tucked up in bed. And Marie von Franz, a Jungian, said that fairy tales show us something great about our collective psyche because they are one of the most unedited versions that we can get to. They are one of the rawest and most classic versions that show us something very specific and that gets passed down. Because right now we're feeding people in the news what they can't take in, and we're wondering why they're hungry and turning to alternative sources of disinformation and misinformation to meet that need. And so I believe that it's on us to consider this. And so I'm researching and I've been looking at how lead users, the people who develop their own solutions to titrating news intake. So this grew from my own work with clients, because I work with people with trauma and minoritized or marginalized identities. And I noticed that people were hacking news titration systems, combinations of web extensions, time-limited websites, newsfeed blocks, keywords, soft blocking of keywords, and started thinking about what would happen if this type of delivery preference was built into the platform, not in a way that excludes or filters out reality, but in a way that allows engagement, because at the moment, these folks are not engaging. And I have been one of them. We are opting out, or we are having it unfiltered, and either way it's unsustainable. So when we're titrating delivery and learning our tolerances, we can, I believe, increase our window of tolerance to hear what is painful and unbearable, not as exposure therapy, but in understanding what we struggle with and how to take care of ourselves through that. Kind of like how to rest, not to quit. But news doesn't encourage us to rest, it encourages us to keep consuming. And journalists themselves can get very vicariously traumatized from reporting, and we need to take more care in all ways, because quite frankly these days the news has too many casualties, and because of it we aren't picking up what we need to pick up. And the world faces huge challenges. You don't need me to tell you this. Climate crisis, pandemic, recession, more. And I believe that handling these will take all of us, because quite frankly certain groups have had more power than others so far, and let's be honest, they haven't done well. We're not in a good state, are we? So I think that to actually do this, to actually make a change and confront some of these things, it is going to take everybody. And to do this, we need to understand and receive the information in a way that we can process and act on. And I hope to be working towards a part of that here. And I'm glad to be on the journey with such a wonderful colleague that I sit with on the panel today, and with you here today and joining me. So I look forward to doing more research and sharing my work, which you can find on Twitter with me at Grace_Contalk, and updates at postculturethemargins.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. I was thinking so much whilst you were speaking about the different ways that care is seldom considered within mainstream news sector organising and activities, and also making connections between what you and Sharish have spoken about in terms of this focus on money and consuming and consumption and marketing. So I was thinking a little bit about, previously we were considering how this notion of objectivity is used in, funnily enough, very political ways. So I always feel when people claim anything is objective, that is a political declaration in and of itself. And sort of reflecting on that, I was thinking about how, as part of your work, you explore the different ways that organizations and institutions will try to absolve themselves of any sense of responsibility, and this sort of neoliberal individualized approach in terms of saying it's down to the individual to try and take care of themselves, or it's down to the individual to try and turn away from news media and news content. So I was just keen to hear more of your thoughts on the role of care in the work that you do, and the different ways we see news organizations quite violently implying that it is down to us as individuals to manage the forms of harm that they are producing.
Fantastic question, thank you. Absolutely. And I start with this piece in drawing on my client work. So just to share, I don't think I'm sharing any client stories here, but if ever I do share an example, they're always with written permission and fictionalized and composite, anonymized, to protect individuals' privacy. What I always really notice in this is when, say, for example, somebody comes to see me in therapeutic work, and we're talking about an issue, and they really often present it as an individual problem. So it's, how do I, build my confidence so that, I don't struggle when my manager uses racist terms against me. That's not a confidence, this isn't a confidence problem. But of course, firstly, we often want to believe as an individual it's an individual problem, because, it's much easier to think, I did something wrong, I can do better. And for example, what can happen when people survive abuse, particularly children, there can be a way of thinking where, who wants to think, actually, terrible things happen in the world, and I feel very, very overwhelmed by them, and they're very difficult. So it's much easier to think, it's painful and it has its issues, but in that moment, we often think, I did a bad thing and then bad things happen to me. I'll try harder and then the bad thing won't happen again, because there's always that false hope at the end of the tunnel that you can be good enough, that the terrible things won't happen to you. And I think so individually we carry the want to hold ownership of our destiny like that. But what I really always think about, and of course we aren't in control over that, we aren't in control if somebody abuses us, it's never our fault. We aren't in control if someone's racist towards us, another form of abuse, that's never our fault. What I always notice when this is happening is to say, who does it benefit to individualize this to you? If you pick this up as your personal project, who gets to put that burden down then in that case? And we look at it, I've mentioned myths in the Selkie myth, which Francesca, you may know, coming from Scotland. Jungians often look at the Selkie myth, which is where the seal woman has her skin stolen, as that she has perhaps lost her skin or become careless somewhere, that she's lost something precious and wild. But I always look at it as, who needs me skinless? Who would it benefit if I am weaker and less shielded? To whom would my skin be most valuable, and who is hunting me today? Because we always look at really, why are they trying to get me to pick it up as a personal project, and what happens to the collective when I do that? And a lot of my understanding of this has drawn from Ghislaine Kulkarni's research with race reflections. I really encourage everybody to check out a fantastic website and resource where she writes a great deal about racism and about the collective around the individualization of that. So my thought with that really is very much, who is hunting me today, or who wants my skin? Who would it benefit if I pick this up? And actually then noticing that and handing it back. We can't expect always that people are going to pick it up in that moment. They're not going to, but we don't have to carry it. That's something that we can do in that day. Thank you.
Thank you. I was thinking a lot when you were speaking there about the rise of sort of marketized notions of resilience training, and this emphasis in 2020 whereby we see organizations who are creating the conditions under which people are suffering, advising us how we can try and do these small things, these small life hacks to make us feel better. And so yeah, I think the work that you're all doing is really brilliant in terms of challenging the different ways we see commercial organizations trying to claim these are problems that are down to us to fix, as opposed to we feel a certain way, and beyond feeling, we experience certain forms of harm and violence as a result of these structures and their existence in their current state. So moving on to hear from Linus, I've been thinking a lot about visual culture and storytelling, which I think has come through from what everybody else has said as well. So thanks for being involved in today's session and drawing on your vital work related to news and visual culture. it would be really good to learn more about how you feel visuals and visual storytelling can contribute to a more inclusive news sector, or again, maybe inclusive isn't the term we're working with here, but why it is important to explore different ways to communicate news to a broad audience.
Thank you. Yes, it is good to be here. I feel like I've learned so much and got so many ideas stirred up from what Sharish and Grace have already said. Yeah, so at the moment I'm working on a R&D project which I call Mapped Out, looking at delivering news to visual thinkers. And I mean, we all think in different ways because we're all unique and we're also all very neurodiverse. But like, a lot of people can think in terms of having an inner voice. It's very conversational. They may, think through their thoughts as words. For a lot of other people, they might be thinking in very narrative terms, very linear. They have their starting point and they work through problems to get the conclusion at the end. Personally, I'm a very visual thinker. In my head, concepts and ideas are all represented by maybe colors, shapes. I think about how they're laid out. And I think about sort of how they fit in with other things, which is the way a lot of people can think. People listening now may be doing it themselves. For example, if certain ideas can have certain colors. If someone's thinking of, if someone mentions a country, they might put it on like a visual map in their head and think, all right, this is what it looks like. Or if we're talking in timelines, people might think, oh, this happened in the past, so it's over there, and then the future happens further on, or past might be behind us. Which this can be the case for a lot of people, and for a lot of reasons. For some people, it's a more autistic way to think. People may have synesthesia, have dyslexia, ADHD, mental health issues, or like me, you might just tick the box that says all of the above. For some deaf communities as well, a lot of people can identify as visual thinkers. And I've heard of people thinking when they're thinking of the word, they're not thinking of how the word sounds, but what the word looks like in British Sign Language. But when we look at the news and how it's presented to us in news articles, in newspapers or on websites, often what we're given is a big block of text. And in a similar way with news reporters on TV, often we have them reporting the story to us and just telling it to us in words. And a lot of them aren't using hand gestures even to give us that sort of simple narrative, the simple visual that a lot of people use in conversation. And a lot of this is really complex information, but it's presented in a very narrow way. And a lot of news sources do have pictures and do have videos, which is a very visual way of communicating something. But from the research I've been doing, from what I've been looking at, a lot of those pictures and videos are out of context without the words around them. We're introduced to what the picture's about, we're introduced to what the video's about. And they have that linear narrative, again, with videos where people are talking within them, or they might be subtitles. When you take those away and just focus on the visuals, often the real key points of the article aren't there. We can't get a lot from that. So what I'm really interested in, the work that I'm trying to look at now, and why it's really important, is looking at how how news can be delivered in a visual way, how the actual pictures, the visuals themselves can tell the story. And this is, I think, really important for a lot of people who don't think aren't so I say aren't so good with the words, which is kind of how I feel like I'm coming across at the moment. But I'm not very focused on words myself. I tend to think in visuals, and I tend to think in images. But it's interesting because when we look at how a lot of things are presented to us, important information, instruction manuals, health and safety posters, in hospitals, they may have images above the sink showing how to wash their hands with images of hands, how they're done. And in those instances, the important information is given in the images. But the news is important information. It's stuff we all need to know. This is stuff that could affect us, stuff that could affect the country, the world, our local town. Things are going to make a big difference in our lives. And they're only presented, almost entirely presented, with words, and giving us those, giving us the information in words, and almost relying visual thinkers are having to do the work to kind of translate that into ways that they can understand things. And this is what my research is focusing on, not just whether or not people can understand the facts that are being given to them, but how they actually process it, how they actually integrate it into something they can use. And for a lot of people studying, or when businesses are trying to get ideas going, they often use mind maps. We have the central word, and we might have other concepts coming off them, grouping things together, which a lot of people are doing internally. But when we only given that the information in text, I think a lot gets lost, and a lot of people are sort of missing out on really understanding what important things they need to know. So this is what I'm hoping to understand more of as well, working with experts in the industry and in media as well going forward.
Thank you. As someone who certainly always needs visuals to think through things and to make notes and colour as well, this really resonates with me. And I was thinking, you covered this a bit when you were speaking, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts around why it is we don't tend to see more of a creative exploration of the use of visuals as part of news and storytelling, and whether or not you think there are sort of hierarchical understandings of knowledge and how to communicate knowledge which creep in there. So whether that's partly the sort of dismissiveness that we see people tend to approach more creative and arts-oriented forms of communication, if that's a part of what's happening, or if you have any other thoughts to share.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think with the way news is presented, often people want to present impartial news, and it sort of goes down a sort of more scientific avenue where we stick to just the facts. And the way I think a lot of people have thought to do that is just with the words. However, when news reports are coming from politicians, for example, they use a lot of hyperbole or a lot of speculation and things that aren't just the facts. But we're still in this way of thinking, the most impartial way to do it, the most unbiased way is just to stick to the facts which relates directly to words. But I think there's another step in there. I think one part of understanding something is getting the facts and knowing what they mean. Another part of it is actually being able to process them, to be able to actually get past knowing something, to get to understanding it. And I think that's where our creative sides come over a bit more, and we need to use the visuals or whatever it is that people use to kind of process that, to make sense of it, to actually integrate it, so it becomes then, I feel, more realized, where a lot of people know that certain things are good for us and certain things are bad for us, and we might have that knowledge, but sometimes that comes to the point where we really understand something, we think, oh, this is really impacting me, and maybe they've had the time to really understand, process that information, really integrate it, and then I say realize because it becomes made real for them. So I think that in a large extent that's what's missing, but I think it's missing because there's still this idea that people want to be very unbiased and impartial in the news, which I don't think is actually happening, but it's a belief that people still hold. Thank you.
Thank you. All of what you've all spoken about is making me think a lot about the different ways that perhaps words or written text or speech tends to be more associated with so-called objectivity and visuals. Perhaps people just assume there's this different type of subjectivity occurring, as though subjectivity isn't always at play. So I see we've had a question that's come through and just some words that people want to share. And I know we've got, I think, at least around about 10 to 15 minutes or so left. So we've got one question: do we need to redefine what news is? And this was, I think, particularly in response to Sharish speaking at the start, but I think it would work well if we have time for each of you to share your thoughts on that.
Shall I go first then? Yeah. So yes is the short answer. We do need to redefine what we think of as news, and that was partly what I was trying to explore with my 7 kind of building blocks for reflective journalism, because things that I think really stuck out for me was that users, I say users, I call them citizens, because I don't like to think of it in that kind of consumerist way. It's thinking about citizens at the heart of this. What citizens want is context, and we very rarely get that from news. So we want to see the grand sweep of a story and figure out where we sit in that. And the principle I use for that is I say what the ultimate aim should be is orientation, that we should be placed in our environment, should be helped to understand it, and ultimately should be given the information that helps us make decisions which align with our own community and personal interests. And actually, what we're doing right now, we see it all around us, whether that's coronavirus kind of conspiracy theories or the kind of Brexit debate, whichever side of that you sit on, that actually people weren't getting the information to correctly orientate themselves. So context is a big thing around that. So one of the reasons we are so terrible at communicating climate change is because the Earth doesn't put out a press release about a big event that's happening on one particular day. It's a long-term process that is happening over time. And news at the moment just focuses on breaking or at least moving news, something we can attach to, something that essentially, practically, we can just put in the planning diary, because it's a really narrow kind of mechanistic way of doing news. So we need to think about context in that broader sweep. There are also things like agencies, like how do we, rather than just doing vox pops, how do we put people in a position where they can also be authors of solutions, rather than just saying train fares are going up on January the 1st. Do you think that's good or bad? Well, obviously everyone says that's bad. But if you said, how do you think the rail industry should be structured? I don't think anyone would say a complicated system of franchises where the company that runs the rails is entirely different from the company that runs the trains. But that's what we have. And actually, if you said that to people, they would say, well, that's rubbish, largely because it is. And actually, but we just asked the question, rail fares are going up, is that good or bad? GDP is another one, the budget, where our interesting interactive content around the budget is you will be £150 a week better off as a result of this budget. Now that is putting better off in such narrow terms, and it's not objective at all, because what it's saying is a small state, low tax economy is good per se. So all these things are just really simple examples of how what we're doing isn't even news. It's not journalism. So actually what we consider is news and just isn't. And so that's why I think there's a big reframing, a revolution perhaps to happen there.
Thank you. Grace and Linus, I was wondering if you've got anything else you want to add to that when thinking about, do we need to redefine what news is and why?
Yes, I really like what Sharice said about orientation, and this is what I feel like that people do like to get updates about news, but I feel like those updates worth most when they're in a context, when they can be added to something else they know something about. And I've many times I've seen occasional news reports about conflict in another country, and I think, well, up until this point, the majority of people saw that. What do they know about that country beforehand? What context are they now putting this into? So although they sort of know what's going on, they actually don't necessarily know what's going on. And you know, I'm not blaming those people for that, because it's the information they're being given. But I do think as well, in terms of what's considered news, I find it interesting sometimes looking at what actually makes it into newspapers, because I think the fundamental idea of news as well is to kind of alert people to kind of get people understanding what's going on, but to alert people when things happen. But if a newspaper is so many pages long, or a news program is so many minutes long, they have to fill that. And I think if we're going to be really authentic, maybe would there be days when once in a while we tune in and say, actually, you know what, not much is happening today, you know, we'll just end the show early. But no, we have to fill that time, we have to fill that space. So then I start questioning, well, why is that actually news? Is it actually news, or is it filler in a way? So yes, that's what I kind of think when people ask those questions. It's a really good question to ask.
Thank you. And Grace, do you have anything else that you want to share to do with that?
Yes, absolutely. So, I'm really passionate about the conversation about context. Sharish puts it, how we orientate people in this. And, it quite a lot of years ago now, I actually stopped watching the news for a whole period. In the same period, I got rid of having television and decided to read only books by women for a year. And so it was a fantastic time. The thing that stopped me engaging with the news was because I was getting reports and was hearing these news reports, and for example, it would have a number of people died in a conflict overseas, and I just thought, you know what? I read history. I've read all of like the new internationalist books of the histories of different places, and I've done all, like, still don't understand what's going on. And it got to the point where it actually started to objectify what was happening, and especially people's deaths. Because actually, I really wasn't, and I'm sorry to say, I subscribed to the internationalists. I was really trying, and I still wasn't keeping up. And maybe that's just on my part, but I really don't think so. So people's experiences were losing context. And it's actually started to get to a point where it's like, oh, 17 died. Well, 36 died yesterday, 17, that's not so bad. I'm sorry, was I actually about to formulate a thought that says 17 deaths is not so bad? That's not okay. I'm not okay with myself and my way of being in the world becoming so numbed to this that I actually start to believe that that's a way of being in the world. And so I said, you know what, until I can make the effort to act, and again, notice how I individualize this in this time, rather than asking when the news, at the time I said, until I can make the effort to fully contextualize and understand what these people's suffering is, I'm not going to consume it, because it will just objectify them and me, and it will contribute to something that I don't believe in. And now, of course, I'm in a conversation saying, actually, I would like you, please, the people delivering this, to position it in a way that it can be understood, because we give people huge amounts of information with news. And there's a little bit dated now because it's published a while ago, but a fantastic book, which Linus introduced me to, Mediated, which talked about how, and I'm really interested in the trauma context, that we get huge amounts of information about, say, a terrorist attack. So we almost get pundits talking about it, we get experts, we get eyewitnesses, we get video from the scene, we get journalists from the scene, we have 1,000 different views. So it's almost like a bird's eye view. We get almost a deification, almost an omnipotent view. So we're getting tons of information. Now, firstly, some of that airspace could be given to actually giving some context, but it isn't. And secondly, around this time of my thinking about the news, I asked my grandmother, who lived through the Second World War, how did you cope with the reports of so many deaths? How did you handle that? And she explained, she said, Grace, we got tiny reports about a paragraph. And she said they came 2 weeks after the people had died at the front. So she said, really, by the time they came, you thought, well, they're already dead, they've been dead for so long, that it almost seemed, it was harder to have people course grief, but the level of that grief to the level of actually watching it live happen as you sit there, for example, being in school and seeing 9/11 and suddenly seeing, content warning, seeing the other tower come down. These moments where you sit there and you're watching it live, so you have an omnipotent view, but you can do nothing. And actually how traumatizing that can be. Whereas, firstly, we could use some of that airspace to give context. And secondly, we can actually consider, and I know I discussed this with both Sharish and Linus before, how people what we actually want people to do. So what the relevance is for people to actually take action on this. So a couple of weeks ago, there was a report on BBC Wales, which I did not read because it mentioned animal death, but it was talking about mutilation of hedgehogs. And I thought, I don't know, if there was some kind of spate of hedgehog hunting, then I might need to take some kind of action, like donate to a hedgehog defense sanctuary, like I don't really know, but whatever it might be. Or if, for example, sometimes you get these horrible events where people are capturing animals, then I would need to take more care with my companion animals, for example. But actually, the amount that I do for hedgehogs in this world is about the amount of capacity I have to do for hedgehogs in this world. There's not a lot more I can do. So actually, reading that news article would not have changed my behaviour whatsoever. It wouldn't have stopped me doing anything because I'm not hurting any hedgehogs. It wouldn't encourage me to do more for hedgehogs because I'm about at capacity with my hedgehog care. So really, it would just occupy space that I could have used to do something else. And what can actually news do with that? What can people do to take away? And if we think of this with Peter Levine's somatic experiencing trauma research, that a key factor in trauma not actually causing PTSD is when people have agency within the trauma of how they respond to it. And that's that we have the capacity to give people in news and we're not doing it. And I'm fascinated about why that is. Thank you.
Thank you. So just as we start to wrap up, I wanted to share a comment that's been sent across. So someone said, wow, you've really summarised in a very accessible manner the challenge that is extending across many sectors, including the public sector, and the actions that many people of difference face. So this came through at some point, and I thought it would be really nice to share that so you get a sense of what you're capturing for everybody right now. And just a couple of questions before I close up. I was thinking something that's really coming through is, this broader question of, do we need to redefine what news is? If so, how and why? But also, what's the purpose of news? So what call to action may or may not be a part of the different news landscapes that we're dealing with? To what extent is news ever going to be objective or impartial? Is that possible? Depending on your maybe epistemological and ontological position, you might have certain views. And I can see that we've had one last question come in. So if we've got time for maybe a very brief response, we can cover that. And that's, can we effectively help people to understand what news to consume? So maybe if each of you had about a sentence or so to offer in response to that, or maybe there might even be a go-to one word or a couple of words, but if anybody thinks, can we effectively help people to understand what news to consume, it would be good to know any final thoughts there.
I'll put something in if that's okay. I think one thing when people are looking at the news is maybe it's kind of a very pragmatic, very simple, maybe a bit overly simple way to look at it, is to ask yourself before you look at the news, why am I looking at this news? What do I want to do with it? And say as well, who is saying it and why? And I think asking those questions as you look at the news, I think, is maybe a sort of small pragmatic way that just gets us to kind of consider a bit more what we're actually consuming and where it's coming from and what the purpose of that is. And I kind of think hopefully small actions like that might encourage people into more of an awareness of what they're doing.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Thank you, absolutely. And just building on this, when we're thinking what we're consuming and why, that we think perhaps are we consuming around what are our values and what's our capacity? So as I look at the news today, what's my capacity? And how do I consume news that allows me to stay within that so that I actually can take action on the news or respond to it rather than just become drunk or perhaps become overwhelmed and too full of something that I can no longer process. Thank you.
Perfect.
Yeah, I would just say, in a way, I think the important thing is, I don't think we have the answers or all the answers. I think we have the questions. And the problem is people haven't been asking the questions, like, is this news? So a really good example of that is, why do we do so much crime reporting if it's not telling us something systemic about the world? It's always presented in essentially, it's kind of essentially just looking at the world to be shocked. And that's what news is relying on. So if we can start asking the questions about how we do economics, is GDP the only way to measure progress? Is crime really a lens to look through the world? So I think it's that thing. We don't have all the answers, but we do have, I think, some of the right questions.
Brilliant. I think that's a fantastic place to end things on, is keep asking those questions, and also we need to keep demanding those answers too. So it's seeing what action will or won't happen on the part of institutions, and knowing that we shouldn't individualize the sense of responsibility that we've been speaking about today. So just to finish up, I wanted to thank everybody once more for taking part, for engaging with this. I really want to thank our three panelists who have been brilliant, and you can find out more about these projects on the Cluster website and social media channels, which I believe should have been shared with you through the chat or in various different places. And I know that our different panelists have individual websites and social media platforms, maybe Twitter accounts that you can find them on too. So please do feel free to read up or watch or just learn more about all the work that is happening. And thanks again for taking part in this session. Take care. Bye.